Hey there, it's Tim, and you have come to the right place. We're going to start the show with a bit of a longer intro. This from a John Oliver Last Week Tonight episode from HBO about maybe last spring, I think, or so. That really kind of gets to the heart of the matter of this week's conversation. Enjoy it, laugh and wince, and we'll see you on the other side to get things going.
We thought tonight it might be a good time to look at sports betting and ask a few things. How it became so ubiquitous, why it can be so damaging, and what fixes might be possible. And let's start with the fact that until fairly recently, sports leagues took great pains to distance themselves from gambling, even forbidding Las Vegas from having its own sports team. In fact, in 2003, Vegas simply tried to buy a tourism ad during the Super Bowl, but the NFL rejected it on the grounds that the NFL has a long-standing policy that prohibits the acceptance of any message that makes reference to or mention of sports betting, successfully solving the one problematic thing about the NFL. The shift from that point to where we are now happened both gradually and then all at once. First, there were the rise of those fantasy sports sites like DraftKings and FanDuel, and then in 2018, this happened.
Now sports betting won't stay in Vegas. The Supreme Court today struck down a federal law that required most states to ban it. The 6-3 ruling declared the federal law unconstitutional, a violation of states' rights. The ruling opens the door to an explosion in betting on pro and college games of all kinds.
OK, first, from now on, all Supreme Court rulings should be announced like that, like a detective spreading out the blurry headshots of suspects on his desk. And while most of those faces in the concurrence make sense, Elena Kagan is a bit of a surprise, although, and I'm not saying this has anything to do with it, she apparently plays basketball on a court in the Supreme Court building and has, and I quote, a devastating layup and jump shot. Cases come and go, but ball is life. The point is, that ruling left it up to each state whether to legalise sports betting, and those fancy sports companies were suddenly incredibly well positioned to mount lobbying efforts to get it passed. And they weren't alone in that. Some team owners were on boards too. Here's the owner of the Washington Capitals and Wizards making the case for sports betting being legalised.
Let's bring these dollars into the sunlight. Let's let it be regulated. Let's let it be taxed. Let's use it for the good instead of calling it gambling and gaming and giving it a bad name.
Wait, what? I get the let's do it legally and tax it and everything, but for the record, people call it gambling and gaming because that is what it is. You want to rename sports betting? To what exactly? Fun with numbers and screens? Banks and balls? Max? That last one is kind of taken, but I know a guy who's probably willing to sell it to you. Now, in that owner's particular case, his interest may have had something to do with the fact that the Wizards are an absolutely terrible basketball team. And a good way to get people to keep watching teams, even bad ones, is by letting them put money on games, as the commissioner of the NBA openly admitted.
The data is clear that if somebody has a bet on a game, even a small bet, they're much more likely to engage in that match. They're much more likely to watch it. They're more likely to watch it for more minutes. They're more likely to be interested in the participants and to follow the sport. So there's no doubt there's a business component to this.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Well, all right, let's get going, shall we? My name's Tim Hanlon. It is Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. I appreciate you finding us. Hope you're doing well, staying warm, and let's get a little serious this week as John Oliver, in his inimitable, humorous way, sets the tone for our conversation this week with an author of I would say to you, an immediately essential book if you are interested in sports, both its past and its future. It is called Everybody Loses: The Tumultuous Rise of American Sports Gambling. And like me, I'm sure you sit back and are just gobsmacked by just the sheer velocity of how things have changed in the world of sports, pro, college, which you could argue is now pro, et cetera, over the last handful of years, not even a decade of the infiltration of gambling and betting And now, very shortly, sort of percolating prediction markets, which, for all intents and purposes, is also gambling. And just the sheer force that has been thrust upon sports, organized sports, since the Supreme Court basically giving the power to the states to allow for professional sports and college sports to be gambled upon legally in this country. And it is a scourge, perhaps, on sports, and it is a gigantically growing business. And you heard some of the somewhat comically, but maybe not so much, issues extant as we grapple with what's going on in the world of sports with gambling and betting. And no, it's not necessarily new. It's not new. Gambling, as you'll hear in our conversation with Danny in a few moments, has been around as long as sports has been around, right? Mostly in the dark shadows. But as you heard there in the little clip there from, and again, that was from HBO's Last Week Tonight, John Oliver's signature show. That is a half-hour clip that I scoped that from. You owe it to yourself to go onto YouTube and listen and watch the entire thing, because you will laugh and cry at the same time. And so many more rich layers to this story, but we're going to get into some of that in our conversation. The perniciousness, I guess, of what gambling represents, and now legal, quote unquote. Yes, it's been around since time immemorial. Heck, Jimmy the Greek back in the 70s and early 1980s, right, in the NFL today with his intangibles, quote unquote, right? The betting lines in newspapers, even though it was largely illegal and maybe a few years thereafter, only legal in Las Vegas and then Atlantic City. But now, not only is it legal, but it is unavoidable and immediate, and in-game prop betting with the quickest of reminders and facilitation via mobile devices, et cetera. It is a completely different world we now live in. And we're going to talk about all of that with our guest this week, Danny Funt, who has this book out that I highly, highly encourage you to get. It's been already sampled in places like Vanity Fair and a bunch of other places. And we're going to get into sort of how we got to this point, what's happened in the last number of years that, frankly, if you haven't been paying attention, seems like it's kind of crept up all at once. But this is something that has the groundwork for this phenomenon has been sort of a number of years in the making. But you can be forgiven if you have not been paying attention to things like the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act of 1992, which kind of set a lot of these things in motion. In the 2010s, when daily fantasy sports, DFS, as the jargon is known as, kind of sort of wet the whistle and set the table for an ultimate court case in the latter part of the last decade that opened the floodgates, so to speak, and probably more to come. We may not have seen the worst of it yet, as these things like Polymarket and Kelshi and these other prediction markets sort of seem to want to crack that door open even wider and perhaps more insidiously into sports and culture and life and bankruptcies and all that kind of stuff that may come from it. But I don't want to tar it too much. I really want to get into the conversation. Before we get there, though, the book, again, is called Everybody Loses, The Tumultuous Rise of American Sports Gambling. It is published by our friends at Gallery Books, and you can find it wherever good books are found. It is just out as we release this episode. But, of course, you can, by all means, get a copy of the book through the convenient links in this show episode, as wherever you're getting this podcast, or go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode with myself and Mr. Funt, and you will find a couple of convenient links to our friends at Amazon, who give us some shekels of referral love when you purchase it that way. And you can get it in hardcover, Kindle, audiobook, and even audio CD versions. And it's this is an essential book if you're a sports fan, You will. This is worth reading. Toot sweet, because this is truly where sports is now, and the questions that come from where we have come in just a short period of time with gambling in the sports realm. And if you stick around to the end of the episode, we're going to give you a chance to actually win a copy of this book too. So there you go. But let's get to that conversation now. Here's our chat that we had with Danny of just a few weeks back. Please, as always, enjoy. For our audience, why don't you give us a bit of a little background about your journalistic day job, and then maybe a little bit of a narrative as to how you sort of got into finally putting a modern and an important lens on what's literally transpiring as we speak now with regards to sports and gambling and all of that. How did you become interested in the topic and say, I'm going to, frankly, do the definitive real story about what's going on?
Yeah, because my day job for more than the past year has been the book, mainly because I came to the belief that newspaper reporting, as proud as I am of the stuff that I did for the Washington Post and other places, was only scratching the surface, honestly, of this story. And there were a lot of mysteries that I felt I needed to be fully devoted to investigating to get to the bottom of. But before that, I think the first piece I ever wrote about sports betting, I used to write a lot for the Columbia Journalism Review about the business of all sorts of media. And as sports betting was exploding across the country, it just struck me that a lot of beat reporters, some of whom literally call themselves insiders, would have access to so much information that would be extremely valuable to a gambler, either if they were ever tempted to place a bet, or people they know who would love to know, who's hurt, but that hasn't been publicized yet. Did the coach mention a game plan pre-game that will affect the over-under? So many things that they're aware of would be hyper relevant to gambling, especially in an era where there's thousands of prop bets available for every game, not just, the spread and the over-under. So I talked to a lot of longtime sports reporters. Wasn't too surprised to learn that a lot of newsrooms have uh, limited rules, if anything, about that. You'd think they'd say, don't be betting on sports you're covering, but it often hasn't come up or is just something that's done under the radar. So learned a lot of interesting stuff for that. And also just it opened my eyes to how in a lot of this, we're really making up the rules as we go with the legalization of sports betting outside Nevada. And that brought my attention to a million stories worth covering.
Well, and we'll get to one of the pivot points, right, which was obviously the Supreme Court decision and the velocity that sort of came thereafter. But before that, I love the fact that you set up this book, and it's basically designed to be sort of I think it's a lens on really, truly what's going on at the moment and how we kind of got here. And there's obviously the short-term story about how that happened, all the sort of things happening over the last, let's say, 9+ years post that court case, but obviously the stuff that was gestating before that. But I love how you even go way back, and one of your first chapters is called Original Sin, because it really brings up the reality or the unreality of gambling. It's been part of society for a long time, to the point where even some of the largest religions on this planet, right, have had shall we say, opinions about the nobility of the practice and why it should not be part of one's life. But maybe a little bit of setup as to how we kind of got into the court case and the modern sort of days and stuff, because sports and gambling have always been in this, I don't know, shadowy relationship, largely illegal, but it's always been there, it seems, right? The earliest days of baseball.
Yeah, literally the very first professional ball games in New York in like the 1850s, there were people, I don't know if there were stands for them to be betting from, but a field or something where they were betting on not just who's going to win, but what will the guy on first steal second? Will the direction of the wind change? It was, as the New York Times put it, largely a contrivance for gambling, which drew a lot of skepticism about baseball, at least in prestigious places like the New York Times. But yes, as you were saying, it's as old as organized sports in the US at least. And a lot of that was a surprise to me. It also, I thought, was such a crucial bit of context to understand this profound 180 that the leagues did, because these commissioners for so long were quite literally the guardian, not just the guardians of their sports in general, but entrusted with protecting their sports from gambling. It was the explicit reason baseball established a commissioner's office after the Black Sox through the 1919 World Series was because gambling, not just in that series, but over the years, seemed to be posing an existential threat to baseball. And all the other sports were similarly wringing their hands about that. So there's one scandal after another, decade after decade, and it brings us before the Supreme Court case to 1992 when the leagues lobbied Congress to pass the federal ban on bookmaking outside Nevada that was subsequently struck down by the court in 2018. But yeah, all that history, I mean, I consider myself an amateur student of American sports history, and a lot of that was a surprise to me, just how firmly entrenched gambling is in sports.
Well, and sure, I'm sure you saw many of those little flare-ups over time, right? The 1950s college basketball point shaving scandals and various things, especially in basketball, which seems to have also become kind of a I don't know, a uniquely manipulatable, especially on the prop bet sides of things for whatever reasons. But it's always had sort of those fits and starts, right? And the legalization of sports gambling, when did that happen in Vegas for the first time, based on your research? Was that from the 50s when it was really starting to take off, or was it later?
Exactly right. Roughly 1950, as a lot of casinos were taking shape. And as I am very clear about in the book, it was really, you could think of it as an amenity, honestly, not too different from an all-you-can-eat buffet of just, here's something to bring people in, say, hey, you can bet on a game. Our hope is that eventually you drift over to the craps tables and the poker tables and what have you, and that's where we'll make our real money. But Nevada was taking bets on sports in the 50s. The federal tax on what's called handle, which is how much money is being wagered, was for a while so high you couldn't really make money doing it. It's a very narrow margin business. So if you're taxing handle at 10% and you're only profiting or generating, as far as revenue goes, what they call hold, which was usually around 5%, doesn't take a math whiz to see that's not a viable business. But casinos were willing to tolerate it as a loss leader because, as I was saying, it brought people into the casino. Over time, though, very quickly, the amount of money being bet on sport in Nevada exploded. Over $1 billion by the time Congress was looking at that federal ban in the early 90s. But
Sure.
yes,
Yeah, and like the NFL and the Super Bowl, right, which is always sort of has always been sort of the people's betting thing, right, and has always felt as an innocuous kind of thing. Everybody kind of does it. You sort of do little informal pools and stuff. I think it speaks to not only being a loss leader, but it's also how can I best describe it? It the non-gambler, shall we say, right? It's the idea of betting on sports is um, has a fantasy element to it, which I'm sure you can speak to, but also it's just more accessible. It doesn't require learning the intricacies of craps or blackjack and the strategies around that stuff. It's as simple as it can be as simple as picking a winner of a game based on a hunch. So it just seems like it's a broader audience that essentially gets a little interested maybe in something in an activity they normally wouldn't have.
yeah, sort of an entry level way to gamble, if you will. Certainly for people who are already interested in sports. And yet, a lot of people, they'll look at the odds board at a sports book and it's just overwhelming numbers and they have no idea what, minus 175 means or this team getting 5-2. So it's easy to forget that a lot of that is alienating or intimidating certainly to a lot of people. And a big part of how the industry has evolved is making it more colloquial so that it is like, oh, hey, I'll 3x my money. It doesn't take quite as much insider knowledge to know what that means and to get going. But yeah, I would also say like because it wasn't the big money maker, not to be naive about the profit motivated mindset of guys working at a casino, but it was a little bit less ruthless of a business. There was a little bit more chumminess between bookmakers and their customers, partly just because they were seeing them day after day, but also because there wasn't the pressure from the casino on this is gonna be our cash cow. And I'm sort of hinting at things to come, but that really changed when companies like FanDuel and DraftKings, that's the lion's share of their business. And so they'd approach it with an entirely different mindset.
I missed this in the book. I'm sure you kind of speak to it, but at what point does the officially licensed gambling thing in sports somehow evolve from horse racing and the occasional high lie and greyhound racing and that kind of stuff to, shall we call them, the more mainstream sports? Is it the sort of fantasy game kind of thing where it's, maybe more prizes oriented and that becomes sort of the elixir to, or sort of the incentive, so to speak, to bigger things? I mean, I'm curious as to how that jump from that sort of specific, almost sport as gaming device dynamic literally becomes much more broadly applicable.
Yeah, I follow you. And it's interesting to remember how much the professional leagues resisted the rise of fantasy sports for a while, which by today's standards seems, as benign as could be. But for a long time, they thought it just kind of cheapened fans' relationship with teams, and the idea that you care about players but not allegiance to your home team was anathema to how they wanted to do business. But yes, I certainly remember I not too long ago, I was going through like old notebooks from back home, and in third grade, I wrote, "Hey, I read about this thing you can do on Yahoo called fantasy football. I'm gonna give that a try." So, yeah, it definitely normalized this idea of applying your knowledge to try to win something beyond just casual bets with your friends, and then of course fantasy sports was always a season-long contest, usually that you do with your friends or eventually online. But daily fantasy sports, if you remember the DFS boom of the mid 2010s, was such a new animal that really resembled gambling in a lot more explicit ways and was a clear stepping stone for not just legalization, but for the companies that would go on to dominate the legal betting business to get a foothold.
And that DFS environment, the daily fantasy sports thing, right, also brought in promotional prizes, right? So it's kind of the chance, literally a games of skill, so to speak, that would actually net out into something, obviously not of the scale of betting, but that maybe almost kind of normalized the idea of an expectation that, hey, if I do well relative to, I don't know, a gigantic pool of players and whatnot, I have a chance to quote unquote win prizes.
Yeah, and often real money. And if you join a fantasy league and you put down, let's say, $20 and 17 weeks later, the group pays out, the first place and second place teams getting a cut of that. For most people, that really doesn't excite the gambling bug in the way that daily fantasy, if you're doing that on a literal daily basis or even a weekly basis, it's much more of a money-making motivation. There were studies of what motivates people to play on FanDuel and DraftKings or Yahoo and ESPN when they got in the daily fantasy game. And it quite clearly was the main motivator was I can make money doing this. And the commercials at the time, honestly, there's so much, I think, deserved criticism of how gambling is advertised nowadays. The way daily fantasy was advertised in the 2010s was a whole other level of really reckless promising of this is, so many of our customers are making thousands of dollars. That could be you. There were good studies that showed how disingenuous that was, and how In fact, there were a few professionals who were very systematically entering thousands of daily fantasy tournaments and making the lion's share. I remember, I wish I had this handy, but it was something like literally 11 people playing daily fantasy baseball were making like 80 or 90% of the money on these top sites. So the idea that, hey, you can make a lot of money is not the everyman experience, but there's no question money was the draw to daily fantasy in a way that it really was not for conventional season-long fantasy sports.
All right, well, describe that against the background of what you were hinting at earlier, right? The teams and so the leagues and the commissioners and whatnot trying to perhaps initially repel against this kind of stuff to quote unquote cheapen the relationship between the sports and the fans themselves, which obviously seems very quaint by today's conversation. But then also maybe sort of layer in sort of what was also a few years behind that evolution in the 2010s. This Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act of 1992, because that was certainly I guess, the legal understanding in those decades, right? And it sets the scene, I guess, for what happens later in the tens.
Yes, sure. So I named that opening chapter that you referenced Original Sin because the commissioners, and a lot of people, but I think the commissioners are such a useful barometer of how sentiment is evolving, really spoke of this in biblical terms, that it was, as many of them put it, an evil that threatened to destroy sports if it were brought into the mainstream. You had really draconian punishments levied against people like Joe Namath. You might remember he had this nightclub in New York that some league officials found gamblers were congregating at, and they said, "Joe, you got to divest from the nightclub, if you want to keep playing in the NFL." And he got very worked up about that. But that's just a taste of how
That was a whiff. That's a
seriously,
mere whiff, right?
yeah. There was no insinuation that Namath was betting or colluding with gamblers. It was just rubbing shoulders with those guys was a definite no-no. You fast forward to the early 80s when there's a lot of states facing very serious budget deficits, a lot of resistance to raising taxes back then, even more than usual. And it began with Oregon, but a lot of states were saying, let's have our state lotteries offer a version of sports betting, mainly on football and basketball, where they'll select as few as 3 and as many as 14 games each week and pick winners. And if they get all the winners right on their cards, they'll get a fixed amount of money. And that kind of state-sponsored betting was so alarming to the leagues that mainly the NFL, but the NFL rallied support among all the other leagues. And they brought the issue to Congress saying, you must do something about this too. We're going to have to, I guess, tolerate betting in Nevada because it's been there for 40 years, but you can't let it spread to these other states. It helped that they had Bill Bradley in the Senate from New Jersey, who had such standing as, of course, a Hall of Fame basketball player, a Princeton grad, someone who could speak with real authority about the threat betting posed, not just to fans who could lose a lot of money, but to the integrity of games, just because he was privy to so many match fixing scandals over the decades. And once again, it was the leagues that championed the cause and convinced the commissioners to put in PASPA, the ban on betting outside Nevada. I found it so interesting, as you'll read in the book, to revisit the testimony from commissioners back then who were just, as I've been saying, speaking in the strongest possible terms. And one quote that stood out was Fay Vincent, who was commissioner of Major League Baseball at the time. I got to interview him about this shortly before his death in, I think it was 2024. Commissioner Vincent was asked if the MLB would ever get in business with gambling, and he said, it would make a mockery of the office I hold if we ever did anything that your question is getting to. So we've gone from make a mockery to make gambling front and center in every possible way when you're trying to watch a ball game these days.
And there's a disingenuousness to this too, because if you harken back to the 70s and the 80s, the idea of having betting lines in the newspapers, right, which is, it's legal in one state, but you're reading it in the New York Star Ledger in New Jersey or whatever, or a state where even the possibilities weren't even remotely possible for professional gambling on sports. I even remember some stories about the North American Soccer League and the Major Indoor Soccer League talking about how they would like to get betting lines in the newspaper so that they could be perceived as a professional top-tier sport, right? There was a belief that if you didn't have a betting line, you weren't being taken seriously as a pro sport. So, I'm conveniently, I think there's a mores of the times, right? And it's interesting how that changes based on the political and or other winds blowing.
That's true. They were asked about that at those hearings and said it's not our preference, but we don't, control what these newspapers are publishing. We could debate whether they'd have the influence to get them to stop if they really wanted to. Not to give guys like Faye Vincent and Paul Tagliabue and David Stern and Gary Bettman back then too much credit because sure, they were, counting numbers and profit oriented just like any commissioner. But I do think they genuinely viewed betting as something they didn't want on such a mainstream in your face scale. And yeah, like if you're determined to find your bookie, maybe it won't be too hard to look up what the odds are. Or got a kick out of the fact that back then at football stadiums, they'd have these payphones where people would line up to call their bookie before games. So it's not like they were oblivious to the fact that a lot of people were betting, and maybe they did facilitate that in minor ways. But I genuinely believe they felt serious convictions that it would not be good for sports at anything close to the scale it's reached today.
Oh, sure. And we did an episode specifically on sports phone, if you remember that from back in the day, right? That, I mean, literally the purveyors of that recognized that their bread and butter was bookies who, at the time back before the internet, right, would call every 15 minutes to make sure they want to see what the game is doing and stuff. So yeah, clearly culturally, there's all kinds of nibbling around the edges. I mean, and even lotteries themselves, right, were the state government legitimizations of, the illegal numbers rackets back in this, 18 and 1900s, right, in the urban areas and stuff. So
yeah, by the way, not to jump ahead or cut you off, but I did find it interesting. Like there was a lot of controversy about the leagues, particularly the NFL, mandating injury reports. And obviously the or at least one of the main purposes of injury reports is because gamblers want to know who's in and who's out. And the defense was this sort of removes the pressure on people to give up information to particularly professional gamblers who are clamoring for that stuff, but really anyone. Like if we forced teams to publicize it, people will be on a level playing field and it won't be such a coveted piece of information. And now, just in the last few months, after some insider trading scandals with gambling and people like Chauncey Billups accused of feeding lineup information and injury information to gamblers. There are rules now on, I think the NBA is saying like hour by hour updates of injuries. So it's a constant headache for the leagues and they can't seem to get it quite right.
all right. So before we get to sort of that vision of the apocalypse coming forward, tell me what's going on between that PASPA passage in 92 or so, early 90s, and the onslaught of daily fantasy sports in the 2010s. Can you give us some of the initial ingredients of the specifics of the cases, plural, that ultimately got us to the Supreme Court in 2018? You mentioned in the book in quite detail, featuring a few fellow Georgetown alums who are arguing one in particular arguing the case, who was a classmate of mine, but I digress.
Who is that?
Paul Clement.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Former
And
Solicitor General.
yeah, And so give us some of the antecedents of that particular case, because as you mentioned, this is one of those situations where every court prior to going to being taken up by the Supreme Court, it was basically a slam dunk all the way up until this they considered it in 2017.
No question. And by the way, I think it's worth noting, I had always assumed that the leagues, first of all, I didn't realize how instrumental the leagues were in the passage of PASPA, that 92 law. But I definitely didn't know that they were so active in lobbying for all the years from then until these court cases. And I got to talk to the NFL's top DC lobbyist, a guy named Martin Gold, and he corrected me that no, we were on Capitol Hill basically the whole time pushing for various tightening of the restrictions on gambling, especially when the internet came around and there was the issue of ways of circumventing gambling bans by taking bets offshore with servers based offshore, and what responsibility do banks and other payment processors have. And that led to a law called UGIA, the unlawful internet gaming. You can look it up, but it's a 2006 law that was basically saying all these sports books that have sprouted in Latin America, we're going to try to do something about that because that's can't be a workaround to this federal ban. But as fantasy sports got so popular, a couple of companies realized that drafting is one of the most fun and engaging aspects of playing fantasy sports. And I don't know about you, but I can't manage fantasy baseball. It's just too many weeks of updating my roster and, figuring out pitching rotations and all that.
But we
But
used to lovingly call rotisserie baseball.
Yes, but the draft everyone loves, and these entrepreneurs, some of whom became quite wealthy, and others are quite bitter that they didn't get to the front of the pack on this, realized that why not just make a shrunken down version of fantasy sports that they call daily fantasy. And it wasn't FanDuel and DraftKings that invented that, but they were the most relentless as far as saying only a couple of companies are going to rise to the top. We need to spend as feverishly as possible to get there. So that's why you were just blanketed with ads in the 2010s. And it got to the point where people were saying we need to regulate this because it's just every commercial during a game is a FanDuel or DraftKings ad. But meanwhile, it's not really connected to that. But meanwhile, Atlantic City is really suffering. A lot of casinos, including some that had big government funding, went out of business. When Chris Christie took office as governor, there was a lot of pressure saying Nevada brings in all this business, not just during the Super Bowl and March Madness, but year round. Thanks to sports betting, why can't our casinos and our racetracks benefit the same? And he had the bright idea of hiring someone he knew from the Justice Department, the Bush Justice Department, Ted Olson, who is probably the most accomplished Supreme Court lawyer of his generation. And Olson, despite those credentials, lost, as you were saying. He went 0 for 6 in federal court until finally, miraculously, the Supreme Court granted cert and agreed to hear his case. And this was quite a tip-off that the odds might have swung in his favor, just because if a law has been on the books for 25 years and every federal court agrees it's constitutional, why take a case unless you plan to reverse those courts and strike the law down? So that was a huge moment, and so much credit is due to Ted Olson for knowing, the exact words that would resonate with the Supreme Court and miraculously get his argument before them.
Well, quick history lesson too, right? Was the first Trump administration, and the beginnings of the reconstitution of that court was well underway as well too. So there's definitely sort of those clouds of change there. I don't want to get in the political sort of realm on this, but it's all part of the bouillabaisse here. And
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but to your point, how many, based on your interviews, which is, obviously extensive and research and stuff, how many people believe that the taking of this case was essentially a de facto uh, uh, event that was essentially going to happen?
Right, that was the turning point. I don't think it's just kind of hindsight bias to think that way. In fact, one of the best or most intriguing details that I wrote about is uh, FanDuel and DraftKings had hired a lobbying firm called Oric. They were such fierce rivals, but occasionally they realized they had mutual interests. And this was one of those cases where they hired a firm to help them battle back all these state attorneys general and regulators who were saying they were offering a version of gambling, and needed to get out of states like New York and Illinois and Nevada. And Oric, upon the court granting cert for New Jersey's case, decided they needed a playbook for lobbying states before a decision was reached. They could get ahead of the game and be sure that states were primed to legalize as quickly as possible. They called it Project Aftermath. And this was done very secretively, in collaboration with some of the leagues, at least on an informal basis, since they were still the parties opposing New Jersey's efforts to bring betting to the shore. But yeah, that was just, you think of the court issuing this verdict and then the leagues and their partners saying, okay, times have changed. We can react to this. In fact, there was a lot going on behind the scenes to prepare for that moment so they could capitalize on it to such a dramatic extent.
So let's talk about the opening of the floodgates. Maybe a little bit of insight as to sort of the major tributaries of that post this case, right? You're saying that efforts had been made to kind of plan ahead a bit. This the dramatic headspin of the sanctity story of leagues trying to protect the integrity of their games to the seemingly unbridled embrace of capitalistic gambling, gaming, and the like, marketing, legal battles via state, the leagues and the players themselves. What do you think were sort of, give us a little bit of a headline over the last 10 years or so that really kind of showed dramatically how things changed from kind of that moment forward?
Yeah, well, if it's okay, just to back up a little bit, I
Please.
mentioned that FanDuel and DraftKings were preparing behind the scenes to position themselves to push states to legalize even before they were allowed to, thanks to the Supreme Court. Around the same time as I write about in detail in the book, all of the professional sports leagues, despite being the litigants of the Supreme Court case, were meeting secretively with the gambling industry and with a few other people that had a stake in the eventual legalization of sports betting. Sometimes it was so secretive, particularly for the NFL and Disney, with its TV rights to different sports, that they insisted on meeting on in cafes on Park Avenue rather than hosting the gambling industry at their headquarters, just because it was still so taboo to even be seen with representatives of casinos. But in those meetings, which were kicked off after, you'll remember, Adam Silver wrote an op-ed in the New York Times in 2014.
Famously, yes.
Yeah, breaking from the other commissioners and saying, let's legalize and regulate this. In response to that, the gambling industry commissioned over $1 million worth of studies from Nielsen, the company that does TV ratings and other media consumption analytics. And Nielsen, everyone sort of figured that gamblers watch more games than normal fans, but Nielsen studied it at a very, very rigorous level for the first time and presented those findings to the leagues. And not only did they see that gamblers watch more than twice as many games as traditional fans do, but they saw projections of all the money they'd stand to make were this legalized. The biggest moneymaker wasn't these ultra lucrative partnerships with sportsbooks, even though those are often worth tens of millions of dollars for each one-off partnership. No, the biggest moneymaker was what it would do for their TV rights, just because they make such a majority of their revenue from rights agreements. And if you can show a network or a streamer that you've got this secret ingredient to make your fans more plugged in than ever, that's going to make your rights billions of dollars more lucrative. So much so that the NFL was presented with the finding that with those direct and indirect consequences, legalization would make the league about $2.3 billion every year, which was about the value of the average franchise every year, bringing that much revenue. So, you might be thinking, how do you turn from saying this is an existential evil? And if you're faced with the opportunity to make billions of dollars a year, it's a little bit more understanding why they caved so dramatically. But the leagues eventually hired the same lobbying firm I just mentioned, Oric, and they had this coordinated strategy where because FanDuel and DraftKings were on such thin ice with states because of the fights they've been having over whether daily fantasy was a form of illegal gambling or not, the leagues were much better spokespeople and faces of the legalization push. And also there was naturally so much concern that gambling could threaten the integrity of leagues. So if we've got the commissioners and team owners and retired legends telling us that actually no, we want gambling, that can put those concerns at ease. So they were so hands-on in one state after another, and I've got some amusing details of that in the book, but so hands-on in getting states to pass everything that FanDuel and DraftKings wanted. I'll just give you one example of that. I spoke with a lobbyist who had been hired by Oric in Virginia, one of the early states to legalize sports betting, and they were gushing about how successful their lobbying campaign had been. And I said, well, surely there was something you wanted in the legislation that you didn't get. What was at the top of that list of things you couldn't convince the legislature to pass? And this person said, no, honestly, we got literally everything we wanted. There was no pushback. So that gives you a sense of how overwhelming the lobbying effort was to get just the absolute wish list of priorities for the betting industry.
You go very deep in the book subsequently about some of the marketing aspects of stuff, these VIP programs. Maybe you can explain this a little bit, and the exploitation of the I don't know, the vulnerable gambler type out there, and frankly, arguably the marketing to continue to create more and more of them. How about a little thought on sort of perhaps an industry that has run amok in terms of its desire to create and extend and maybe take significant advantage of the marketplace?
All of it, yeah, I'm happy to go into detail on that. And all of it, I hope, advances the point that this is such a more complicated and important conversation than to legalize or not to legalize. Even still, 7 years after that Supreme Court decision and well into the legalization era, at least in much of the country, the debate gets, I think, reduced unfairly to that binary, when in fact, there's so many issues of potential predatory or exploitative behavior that the industry is allowed to get away with. And that's not my language. That's words I hear again and again from even not just gamblers, but people who work in the industry. And the VIP business and the state of that business is such a vivid example of that. I didn't realize how valuable the most valuable customers are to a sports book. Like you go to a casino, they've got the high rollers room. You figure some of the top customers get, free suites and other, a steak dinner and other perks like that. What the online sports betting industry has done to pamper these VIP customers blows that out of the water. And it's because about 2% of customers contribute about 60 or 70% of revenue. So honestly, guys like you and me who might be betting 20 bucks a game are largely an afterthought to the business. They advertise with a big net, so they'll get a lot of us, and the hope is they'll bring in a whale who's betting tens of thousands of dollars a game, sometimes even way more than that. And for those customers, they'll give them truly the most fantastic experiences imaginable if you were a sports fan. The ability to throw out the first pitch at a Major League Baseball game, play pickup basketball on an NBA court, attend shoot-arounds that are closed to the public, watch those shoot-arounds with retired legends, and then go up to a suite and keep watching it with these beloved former players. I found it amusing that at a NASCAR race, a VIP of BetMGM's got to give the starting command where he yelled out, "Drivers, start your engines." The list goes on, and I honestly ate that stuff up as I was hearing about it, just because it's so unbelievable to me. It even goes further than sports stuff. I heard one VIP host at FanDuel tell me quite proudly that a colleague of his had caught wind that a customer's dog had passed away, and they sent them a sympathy gift basket that included a blanket with a custom embroidery of their dog's face as a message from FanDuel that we feel for you. And when you've got that level of intimate connection between a sports book and their customers, it's so difficult for people to pull back. Not only because they don't want to give up all the perks I was just mentioning, but they don't want to lose that friendship with this person who's texting them night and day, going to games with them, going to dinners and out drinking with them. Like they really try to become a friend to these customers as long as they're losing as much money as possible. And just to sum up on this, there was a high level VIP official at DraftKings who pointed out that really to maintain VIP status, not only do you have to be betting a lot of money, that's honestly a starting point. Really, you have to be betting a lot of money irresponsibly, betting kind of haphazardly, a ton of money here, 10,000 here, 20,000 there. I'll refill my account mid-game, bet another 10,000, you name it. Like very little rhyme or reason to their betting. If you show any signs of competence or deliberation in the bets you're making, how much you're risking, pacing yourself, you're vulnerable to lose VIP status. So this again is just evidence that it's way bigger than legalization. It's an industry run rampant, and states that are so ill-equipped or unwilling to regulate at the levels that seem necessary.
Well, you layer in tech and optimization algorithms and all that kind of stuff too, and the immediacy of prop bets and those kinds of things. I mean, it's going to get a lot worse before it even gets corralled to even close to being on the road to being better.
No doubt. Part of the problem is that there's a lot of technical expertise that goes certainly into bookmaking, but also into regulating. And I've spoken with veteran regulators in Nevada who see the efforts that states are making, and they kind of laugh, honestly, or say worse of just how outgunned they are and how they're hiring, former police officers or people who did the lottery. And sure, the lottery is also gambling, but it's an entirely different animal than an online, highly sophisticated sports book, and protecting customers from all of the nuanced ways that they can be taken advantage of just takes a level of specialization that states don't come close to having.
Maybe we can sort of corral and land the rest of this conversation into sort of what is to come ahead. I mean, I think as we record this in early 2026, right, we have to remind ourselves that it's only been 7-ish years or so, maybe a little bit longer, since this court case, the overturning and the unleashing of all this stuff has occurred. So we're very much in medias res in all of this, right? But you spend a lot of time, and the book is titled specifically "Everybody Loses." There are a lot of everybody's here, including, I mentioned marketing and stuff. The Talk maybe a bit about the insidiousness of trying to appeal to youthful players, especially young males, not even adults. It's almost like a training wheels thing to kind of get them hooked and embedded even before they can, their frontal lobes are fully developed.
Yeah, a good example of that is there's a receiver on the Patriots named Kayshon Boutte, who is about, I guess, when this comes out, we'll find out if they beat the Chargers, but he's about to play. He just wrote a very impressive essay in the Players Tribune about how he got addicted to sports betting at LSU. And I mean, the number one thing that health experts I talk to are worried about is this surge of gambling among young people, certainly college students, but even far younger, which for me, I was as plugged into sports as any of my friends. Like you, I wrote about it for the college paper. It never occurred to me to place a bet, or definitely didn't occur to me to bet on every game I was watching. And that is the reality for the generic sports fan nowadays, including at those young ages. So, where that's going to go is unpredictable, but it has a lot of people frightened because sports betting, unlike uh, drug addiction or alcohol, other addictions where very early on you can identify if someone has a problem. Sports betting, when it becomes a problem, typically does so what experts call progressively. So it can take years to realize that you're in over your head or you have a compulsion. Sometimes it takes a big win and then you spend the rest of your life chasing the money and the feeling of that big win. So we have no idea, even if we're seeing classrooms where people are betting, on their laptops or on their phones during a lecture, and we worry where that's headed. We have no idea the scope of this public health crisis that could be unfolding. You mentioned the title of the book, Everybody Loses, and not to give away too much of what you might find out if you read, but the point of that title is that, yes, Americans lose something like $15 billion a year on a monetary level, and that's a whole lot of money, but it's so much more than money. The integrity of the games, the independence of sports media, faith in the leaders of the leagues to look out for the best interests of fans, even the relationship that fans have with sports. And I don't want to get too preachy about that. It's really something for individuals to reckon with. But I do think it's worth pointing out that a lot of people say, I used to just love a game for the game's sake. And now if I don't have money on the line, I find the game boring and I lose interest, even watching my favorite team. And that fundamental shift means a lot long term and really means a lot for why we even care about sports in the first place. So everybody seems to be losing. And as far as who's winning, I think that's a lot of a trickier question to try to answer.
Yeah, we're encourage people to get the book, of course. That's why we do these things. I'm really curious as to wrap up your thumbnail on what you're keeping an eye on, assuming that you're continuing to be interested in the evolution of this, whether it's another project or whatever related. What's it? What do you sort of see in the future? What do you sort of believe might sort of fold out, both better or for worse? I look at prediction markets, right, and
Yeah.
the uptake of that, and the is that better or is that worse? Probably. I see other industries. I read this week as we record this, the folks at the old Movie Pass subscription service are trying to essentially bring this kind of prediction marketplace and betting, if you will, which is really kind of what it is, into the entertainment industry. Um, what do you think is ahead in the near term based on all the research and the synthesis that you've done?
Yeah, you can already bet on Oscar winners on these prediction market sites. So I'm not surprised that that caught their attention. No, I'll rip through three things that are top of mind for me. One is whether it's prediction markets or maybe more alarmingly, the spread of online casino gambling. Maine just legalized that. More states are under pressure to do that. Basically, giving you, just like you can bet on sports from your phone, why not let you bet on slots and craps and blackjack and all the conventional games you'll find in a casino, often provided by the companies that have perfected online betting, like FanDuel and DraftKings, are also online casinos where it's legal, that we might see more of. From an integrity front, I just think what we saw at the end of last year with arrests in baseball and the NBA could be the tip of the iceberg. There's just too much ground for these leagues to police. And everyone keeps telling me that a much more devastating scandal seems inevitable. And lastly, not to sound alarmist, but I think there's no way around it. The threats and harassment that college and professional athletes, coaches, and refs are receiving from gamblers is at such a frightening, terrifying level nowadays. And it's not just confined to the internet. There are people who've stalked athletes at their team hotels and at their homes. The Padres manager just resigned. In part, he said, because he was so fed up with and just exhausted by getting death threats from gamblers. And when I talk to people who've worked in security for the leagues, they worry that it's a matter of time before someone is attacked. Like what's now a threat, someone actually acts on it and tries to kill someone because they cost them a bet. And if there's anything that can be done to prevent that, I think it would make a ton of sense to do it before disaster strikes.
All right, here's my last question, and I promise. Given the fact that sports now is especially professional and arguably college, and the expansion in international markets and all that stuff, it's an asset class, right? And the private equity now, devoting funds and buying and creating bigger funds for literally passive and increasingly more, operational oversight and investment opportunities and returns and stuff. Do you think, I mean, that alone to me is interesting and alarming perhaps, and the integrity of what was about playing games and sports and fandom and stuff becoming much more the playground of the rich and affordable only to a certain part of the world, and the FIFA thing and all that kind of stuff. But also when you intertwine that or pollute that with what we've talked about for the last hour or so, do you worry about the volume of money now that seems to be entering into sports as investment? Does that have another contributory effect to some of the things that you outline in this book?
I definitely worry about it as a fan. As a journalist, the thing that strikes me most about it is just a lot of what we're talking about today feels like evidence of very short-term thinking. Like I was mentioning TV rights, and yeah, you could maybe jack up your viewership or your TV ratings if you introduce gambling and sign some lucrative TV deals. But where does that lead if your fans are also at risk of becoming addicted to gambling more than ever? Or even if they're just burning out because it's become so expensive to not just go to games and pay for TV packages and the like, but also you're just spending thousands of dollars on gambling year after year. A lot of people in the gambling industry even worry that you're bleeding people dry in a way that is unsustainable. And if you've got that kind of private equity or other investing interests that definitely think on a quarter by quarter basis and not with the long view, I don't think that's good for sports.
Yeah, that power of the logo and the team and the sport and that kind of stuff. You wonder if that organic interest and that fandom could get, taken out with the wash and all this stuff if and when, is it a bubble? Is there a major, crisis event that you mentioned before that's likely to happen? Yeah, I mean, look, this podcast is all about kind of looking back and not necessarily nostalgically, but just kind of like the craziness of what used to be sports. And it gets into like, how people became fans in the first place and all that stuff. And we try not to be old men yelling at the clouds, and tends to be men listening to this, let's be honest. But, the whole notion about where it's all going, there's stuff behind all of it, right? The Yankees logo and the future of, the NFL and all these things were built on the backs of, a lot more, interesting and maybe more, I don't know, pure interests and fandom, involvements that the legacy of all that stuff can very much be in jeopardy too. That's worrisome, and it's just it makes me sad, and that's the problem I worry about most about sports is we may be losing a whole lot more than just financial access and that kind of stuff, and societally at that.
I agree. I wrestle with it a lot, but I did largely leave it out of my book just because I think it's such a kind of personal matter of where you come down on that. I think a lot of people who are worried about the spread of gambling are sometimes a little timid about saying that because they don't want to come off as a scold or a prude or a moralizer. But really, if you read, and I'm not trying to, hawk my book, but if you read some of the stuff
What do you
that
mean you're not trying to hawk your book? Come on, what kind of you got to promote, man? Come on.
Yeah, my wife would hear that and say, well, you should be hawking it a lot more. But no, I just don't want to come off as, self-interested. But my point is just this stuff often boils down to just basic fairness and also using our love of sports against us. And there are examples of that, of how bets and odds are constructed to take advantage of the fact that you might be more hopeful than a rational person would be, or more inclined to root for a positive outcome. All that stuff is leveraged against fans. And then stuff that we've been talking about of just more cut and dry exploitation. I don't think you need to worry about being a moralizer to say that's not right. States or the federal government ought to do something about that.
Danny, this has been great. Thank you. This is a tremendous conversation. The book I think is just absolutely fascinating. Costas was right on the back of your book. It is totally could not be more timely, and I hope it becomes the essential tome. I'm sure there are other authors out there trying to chase this, but if anybody is looking to truly understand literally what we find ourselves in the middle of, and it's kind of like a cloud. It sort of is around out there, and then it sort of comes a little closer, and then all of a sudden you're in the midst of it. I think that's really where we are right now with this stuff. And this is a really good primer and, beacon into sort of what we're dealing with here, and potentially for better or for worse, what the future of sports looks like.
Well, thank you, Tim. I really enjoyed getting to speak with you about it.
All right, my thanks to Danny, and I cannot recommend this book more highly. If there's anything that you will and should read in the coming weeks to best understand how we got to this point in sports with sports gambling and betting, and what is at the precipice with prediction markets coming around the corner, this is the book to get. It is it's a very compelling read. It's not a huge chore, and you will learn a ton, and you will automatically understand how we got to this point over the last 5 to 10 years, and obviously the predecessors of this period of time that we're living in now. It is called Everybody Loses: The Tumultuous Rise of American Sports Gambling. It is written by our guest this week, Danny Funt. It is published by the good folks at Gallery Books, which I believe is a Pegasus imprint. And it is available, as they say, wherever good books are found. Of course, you can conveniently, and most conveniently, hopefully, purchase a copy through the links in this podcast episode description, however you're receiving this episode this week. You can also go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com and search up this episode with myself and Mr. Funt, and you will find convenient links to our pals at Amazon, where we get a couple of shekels of referral love when you purchase it that way. And this is available in not only hardcover version, but also an audiobook fashion. You can get it as a Kindle offering, as well as an audio CD. Is that still a thing? Apparently so. However you get it, by all means, do indeed get it. And as I promised, we're going to give you a chance to win a copy. But first, before we do that, I want to shout out to Danny's Substack. You want to follow more about Danny's writing and the journey behind and afterwards of this book. Just search him up on Substack, Danny Funt, F-U-N-T, and you will find all that you need to know and to follow what's going on with the promotion of this book and the stuff that went into it. The book is a promo opportunity. We appreciate the folks at Pegasus and Gallery Books, both of those imprints, for allowing us to give you a handful of copies to win for yourselves. And here's the trivia question. If you're the first, the first three people to answer this trivia question correctly, and send it to our email address at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. We timestamp them, so the earliest correct entries, the first three of them, will win a copy of this essential book, Everybody Loses. And here is that trivia question. We hinted at Jimmy the Greek Snyder, who was obviously on the NFL Today on CBS for many, many years, late 70s, early 80s, mid 1980s. And he was essentially the gambling voice, if you will, although gambling wasn't sort of officially allowed, so to speak, right? Nor the intimation of such on the air. But of course, Jimmy the Greek was the wink, wink, nod, nod guy, giving all these sort of last minute insights into maybe, who had the edge this week and what teams might be better positioned to win that week's games. NBC, with their pregame show, tried to have the answer for Jimmy the Greek on their show. It was called NFL 83, and then it was NFL 84. But NBC's pregame show had a guy as well who was essentially their answer to CBS's Jimmy the Greek. Who was that guy on the NBC pregame show? I'll give you a hint. He was a legendary sports writer and columnist before getting that gig on NBC. He wrote for Sports Illustrated and Newsweek, and famously helped get Newsweek's challenger to Sports Illustrated up and running, called Inside Sports. Who was the guy who was NBC's counter, shall we say, to Jimmy the Greek on their the NFL and NBC pregame show? Just give me that person's name, that sports writer's name, and you will win a copy. Be one of the first three to answer that question correctly, and you'll win a copy of this great book, this essential book, Everybody Loses. All right, hopefully everybody will win by following us on our socials. You can follow this show on various places, like the Twitter X thing. You'll find us at Good Seats Still. You will find us on Blue Sky at goodseatsstillavailable.com. You will also find us just about everywhere else in social media at Good Seats Still Available, all one word, including YouTube, where we stream these shows as well for your listening enjoyment. You can send us other email if you'd like, besides entering the contest this week, to hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. And again, goodseatsstillavailable.com, that's where all of our episodes are posted, and all of our merchandise, and you can buy us a cup of coffee there if you'd like, and some promotional friends there at some great places like oldschoolshirts.com and royalretros.com. Great forgotten sports memories there for you to consider and purchase there. Thanks to Jerry Payne, who has once again dialed up some amazing audio excellence this week. We appreciate his production skills, as well as we appreciate your listening to this show. Hope you learned a lot like I did. And we look forward to another fun-filled, exciting episode next week. God knows what it'll be focused on, but I assure you, you will find it enjoyable. So stay tuned to your feeds, and I appreciate you listening to no end. Take care.